It's a great pleasure to be back with you. I did not bring any PowerPoint slides. I had a chance to be here in the fall and talk a little bit about what I'm thinking about right now. But I have to begin by saying when I heard the term last lecture series, I had a kind of senior moment and thought it referred to my last lecture. And then I started worrying about the selection criteria in the market, people on their last legs and so on. So I think Myron had a similar. Then I realized it was your last lecture series, and I felt better. I want to tell you one story. It's completely sort of an aside, I guess. But I had the great good fortune, just luck, to receive the Nobel Prize in the year that was the 100th anniversary of the Nobel Prizes. Not actually economics, which began in, I think, 1968, but all the rest of them. And so I think there were 700 to 750 Nobel Prize winners in the first century, one of whom was Myron. And of those, maybe 280 or so are still alive. So they invited them all back. Now, there's only two requirements once you've been selected to receive a Nobel Prize. You actually have to show up in Stockholm, and you have to give a lecture. And they're serious about this. And normally when you give this lecture, you give it to a distinguished group of Swedish faculty and students in your field, plus other interested people. Well, but in this one year, something happened that probably couldn't happen any other time in your life. When I got up to give this lecture, in the front row was Myron Scholes, Bob Merton, Paul Samuelson, Milton Friedman, Carrie Becker. And I literally started to shake. I was told that this was rather open-ended. So the way I got started thinking about this lecture was I thought about my own life, which is now accumulated 60 years, and I made a lot of mistakes in the course of this life, and I thought I learned from some of those mistakes. And so I mentally started assembling the subset of that learning that I thought might be useful or of value to you. And then I started to think, well, now I've got a time limit here, so I ought to figure out a way to wedge this all in to the time. And I was getting kind of frustrated by the whole exercise. So I asked my wife, Monica, what I ought to do. And she said, well, you could just speak very slowly. Let me be briefly autobiographical. I grew up in Canada. Actually, we both did. But Myron was a student, and I played ice hockey. And when I was 11, I played for a team called Ted's Pals. Ted actually existed. He is the worst hockey player I ever saw, just without question. But his parents owned the largest drugstore chain in Toronto, and they co-sponsored the team along with the Chicago Blackhawks. And I played defense with Ted and experienced this egregious departure from meritocracy. And I learned a lesson, which is not everything is a meritocracy. And I learned something about myself, which is that, and about other people later in life, which is some people react very badly to that. And I found I reacted to it with kind of amusement. But it is certainly a feature of the world. We played 96 games that year and won the national championship in Canada, and my grades, as the pundits say, skyrocketed downward. And the athletic director of the school I was in is a man named Jack Life. I remember him very well because he was 4'6". And now remember, I'm 11, so he called me into the office and he looked up at me. This is true. And he said, if you do that again, meaning play for that team, I'll get you kicked out of the school. So we were too polite in those days to have an argument with an elder, but I looked pretty skeptical, and he looked at me. And he said, young man, I want you to understand just one thing. He said, this is a democracy, and I run it. So that was my first lesson in governance in an academic setting. I moved on. I actually did become a better student and a worse defenseman, and have headed off to college at Princeton. where I think I was told later that I was the only known admissions mistake. They thought I could play hockey. It was great fun playing there. We were terrible. Well, maybe not just that. We weren't very good. But there wasn't much to do in Princeton on the weekends in those days. It wasn't co-ed. And we were the best. We were the best comedy show in town. For those of you who like baseball and history, we were the New York Mets of college hockey. We made hilarious mistakes and snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, mostly because we had a goalie who was a cross between a sieve and a funnel, depending on where the puck was going. So I eventually decided to try to become a teacher and scholar and had a wonderful time doing that. And then for reasons I've never fully understood, I ended up for a period of time in academic administration as a dean. And one of the first lessons I learned in that job, and the first one was at Harvard, was that students had no idea what a dean does. None. So I was the dean of students, the dean of freshmen, the dean of the college, the dean of whatever. I was really the dean of the arts and sciences. And when my wife and I got married, I told her what I had done at Harvard, and then I overheard her introducing me as the dean of arts and crafts. Presumably at that well-known Harvard summer camp. But slightly more seriously, one of the things I think not everybody does, although some do, and I certainly have, is kind of change careers. I mean, in a significant way, change what I was doing for chunks of time. So I was a teacher and scholar mainly for about 15, almost 20 years, and then a dean for another 15, and now I'm kind of indescribably spread out. But I thought I'd just say a couple of words about that pattern of career. And I thought I'd do it in terms of benefits and costs. So the benefits are pretty easy to describe for those who have an inclination to do this kind of thing. There's change, there's challenge, there's a lot of learning, which is both fun and actually quite useful if there's any relationship between these things. The costs are a little harder to describe, and I thought a lot about this. I think I can put it this way. What you think to yourself when you're doing this is expanding your portfolio, learning new things, becoming a broader person, and all that. That's not what, you may be the only person who thinks that. Other people remember vaguely for a while what you did before. I remember I went through being the former economist to the ex-economist to the late economist. But what really happens is that eventually you get to a point where nobody remembers what you did before, and some of the enjoyment of a career is all the stages of it, and you will give up some of those later stages by this switching around. And I didn't realize this at the time. I was kind of consumed by the fun, the learning, the challenge, and to be honest, I wouldn't change any of it now, but I thought I would tell you that there are real costs associated with this hopping around. I don't think this is an occasion when one should hand out advice, and I will try to avoid it. The place where advice gets handed out in large quantities, of course, is at graduations, which many of you are going to experience in the near future. But I do want to tell you a story. Monica and I listened to the Prairie Home Companion a lot, and Garrison Keillor came on one day and said he was describing a graduation address that he gave at a high school in Minnesota several years ago. And in the course of this address, he was handing out free advice. He urged the graduates not to be afraid to make mistakes, i.e., not to be too risk-averse in the choice of the careers and activities, what they do, which is actually pretty good advice. I mean, I've even given that advice because I think for people who are as talented as you are, there are a lot of things, including not only not wanting to disappoint yourself, but all the people around you who have very high expectations of you, who kind of push you in the direction of not taking a chance on not being as successful as you have. But be that as it may, anyway, he told these young people, and not to be afraid to make mistakes. And a few years passed, and he learned quite by accident that a non-trivial fraction of that class ended up in jail for a variety of kinds of white-collar crimes. At which point he thought to himself and said on the radio, I didn't mean big mistakes. I meant little mistakes like using the wrong fork to eat your salad, that kind of stuff. Well, I still think the idea of not being afraid to fail in the pursuit of improbable goals is something that is worth bearing in mind, and I'll come back to it a little bit. I'd like to say a word about the world in which you are going to be important leaders. And I think honesty compels me to say, and I say this with some sadness, because when I think of it, I think of you and the things that you will face as challenges, but also my own children. It's a world that's pretty complex. Myron and I grew up in a world which was dominated by the Cold War, pretty well for our whole adult lives. And while the Cold War wasn't fun, and the idea of mutually assured destruction certainly wasn't pleasant, the Cold War had a stabilizing effect. And the aftermath of the Cold War, it seems to me, is a much more difficult and messy world. It, on the one hand, is a world of increasing connectedness, economically, and in terms of all this technology we're fascinated with, communication, ability to integrate markets, create new markets, integrate supply chains, change values of assets, intangible and tangible, all over the world. But it's also a world that's fragmenting in a particularly dangerous way, as I see it. And part of the reason for that is that there are increasingly apparent dramatic differences in income, wealth, health, education, and hope that are threatening to tear this world apart. I don't think anybody seriously argues that terrorism is caused by purely economic phenomena, deprivation. On the other hand, most people would agree that where you have a world in which there are terrorist organizations surrounded by literally hundreds of millions of people who do not reasonably believe that their grandchildren and their children will have a chance to live with less deprivation than they have, that world is a fertile field for disaffection and violence and even terrorism. I view this as, at a kind of summary level, the great challenge that your generation is going to have to face head on. It's an incredibly hard set of problems. It's part economic, part political, part governance, part communication, and it will probably take the best that the human mind and spirit has to offer for more than one generation to make a big dent in this. And I wouldn't presume tonight to suggest how this should all come out. But it seems to me there are opportunities to make a big difference. There are leverage points. There are ways to think about it that are promising, even though the challenges are great. So I don't think of it as hopeless. But the one part of this complex equation that seems to me is certain is that if the citizens of the advanced countries, we are approximately 20% of the world's population. But if we don't think of this, and by this I mean health, education, and economic progress for the other 4 billion people who don't live in an advanced country, if we don't think of this as a priority, and it isn't clear to me that we do, then nothing will happen. And the reason is that we live in democracies. And we are used to the idea in our economic and personal lives that we all pick things to do. And it works pretty well. I mean, economies work and decentralize in a remarkably effective way. And it goes beyond that. We pick our local communities, and we live in different communities, and we support them. But it doesn't get at the notion that we have a collective responsibility, in my view, to get some of these priorities that run all over the world right. So we live in democracies, and therefore it's either us or nobody who are going to set this as a priority. If we don't think it's a priority, it won't be a priority to take a running shot at these tremendously challenging things. And to me, what that means is that over time, we have to imagine that the idea of citizenship will change somewhat, not dramatically. The way I think of it in quantitative terms is that the idea of citizenship becomes a little more expansive. It's an extension of it to the notion that it goes past our own borders. In America and in the GSP, we have a big advantage. We're, as a country, a collection of immigrants. We're two perfect examples of that. We have ties, family and other, all over the world. We are diverse. We have learned how to live together in a diverse way. And much of the same could be said as the mirror image in the wonderful school that you've been in. And in addition, we in America are uniquely in the position of having an enormous amount of military and economic power. So it seems to me that putting those two things together, we have a kind of natural leadership role that's been thrust upon us for a period of time. It won't last forever. And I think it's important. Now, let me be specific. There are 30 to 40 million HIV-positive people in the world. AIDS is in the process of partially destroying at least one continent. 6 million of those people are active AIDS cases. There are countries in which more than 30% of the elementary school teachers are HIV positive and will likely develop active AIDS symptoms. On the other hand, in the last few years, the science that we've come to rely on has developed remarkably effective antiretroviral drugs. So we have an opportunity here that probably we're talking $50 to $75 billion. But more important, and here's the challenge, it's going to take setting up priorities, and it's going to take a coordinated assault by nations, meaning governments of developed and developing countries, of all the international institutions that are involved, the pharmaceutical companies and everybody. There's a lot of people working on this. Major foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But if you stand back from it and look, it's kind of stalled. We have not found a way in terms of global governance to get at this problem. Agriculture. The advanced countries have politically motivated, protectionist-oriented fights with each other. My image of international negotiations about agricultural subsidies and trade barriers is we first argue with Japan, and then we argue with Europe, and then the Europeans argue with each other. And, Dave Brady and that whole group can explain to us why this happens. I understand and don't mean to be naive about it. But once again, that pattern of interference in open markets has its main effect in the developing countries, where probably 70% of the people are in agriculture, and these are barriers to supply-side adjustments to market conditions that have, I think by general agreement, large negative effects. The global markets, by the standard of the markets that Myron was describing a few minutes ago, are relatively immature economically, informationally. That is, if you take the standard as the information network and flow and insight and research that surrounds the best of our domestic financial markets, and then ask what fraction of that have we achieved in the global markets, because we're on a learning curve, because we're having to learn about more assets, and so on. The answer is we're making big progress, but they are informationally immature. They are volatile as a result, and that volatility has caused considerable harm to people. And so the thing I want to say about this is a more general point, but this illustrates it. There's no theory that I know of that suggests that markets that have informational asymmetries that are serious, of the type we studied 30 years ago, or markets that are informationally immature, will work just fine in the absence of regulation. Nobody who's smart has stood up and said that. Markets work beautifully when the informational system surrounding them is quite perfect, even if there's residual risk, and the institutions are built up to handle that. But the point I'm trying to make is that the market system in the global economy is being oversold. And that's part of the pushback that's coming from the anti-globalization movement. It's being oversold not because it's unimportant. Anybody who's a serious student of the experiments that were conducted in how to run an economy in the 20th century will realize that the market system won, and various forms of planned economies didn't. So nobody now would stand up and say you don't need a market system. Now, translated into scientific language, that means a market system is a necessary condition. If you're any economy, but particularly one that's relatively poor and short of resources, you can't operate inefficiently and expect to grow and thrive over time. So we all agree on that. Then it's a very short step to the statement, all you need is a market system. That, translated into science, is a market system is necessary and sufficient. And you don't have to worry about public sector investment in infrastructure and human capital. You don't have to worry terribly about the building of the regulatory system that allows the market and legal system. You don't have to worry a huge amount about getting the corruption out of the system and so on. So it's fundamentally it's a model that people carry around in their head, hoping that it's true, and it's not. I was asked by a European journalist today, after we talked about growth, economic growth in North America and Europe and Asia, and the rigidities in the European market that make their labor markets and other markets more, difficult to adjust. This person asked me two questions. One was, do you think the Europeans should change and get rid of these rigidities so they can grow faster and adapt in a world that's requiring fairly rapid adaptation? I said, no, it's not the job of an American. If you get rid of rigidities that are just totally unnecessary, then the answer is surely yes. Their pension systems are poorly constructed, for example. They've got people with defined benefits retiring at 57 with life expectancies of 80 plus years. I mean, it's financially impossible, and they can't stick with that. They'll have to go to a menu of options that looks something like a defined contribution system, so people have to do a calculation of how much income they want per year as they get older. But the real response is it's not for an American to tell Europeans how to make the choice between safety nets and protecting people and economic efficiency and growth. To the extent that's the issue, I can easily see why people would make a different choice than we have in America. And then this person said, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the global economy? And I did a typical academic thing. I paused, and then I said, I'm cautiously optimistic. And then I thought, that's pretty embarrassing. I better explain what that means. It just sounds like hedging of the worst kind rather than the good kind. What I mean is, I'm optimistic because I think we have the means to deal with the problems that I've waved my hands at that you understand, might describe differently. And I'm cautious because I'm not sure if we have the will. It's just that simple. So my uncertainty about the future is not whether we have a way to deal with these problems, however challenging they are, but whether we'll get organized to actually do something about it. Let me just conclude by saying a few words, because I wanted to leave some time for your questions rather than just go on, about stages in life. I actually think Shakespeare is right. There are stages in life. They are accompanied by gradual transitions. But the reason I say that is that I'd like to try to characterize the stage you're in. And I think of it as the period in your life in which your creative power is at its maximum. It's clearly associated, in my mind, with youth. That doesn't mean there aren't very creative people who are older. But there are reasons why this is the period in which you have the greatest capacity to create something new and to change the way people see or experience the world or even each other. First of all, you've got the energy. Second, you've got mental and emotional discipline that you've developed in your careers to date, including these demanding educational institutions. And hopefully the educational institutions have helped build that set of capabilities. You've wrestled with intellectual and emotional complexity by now in your life, and that's important. But the most important thing is that, in some deep sense, you're unbiased. You are not jaded or trapped by either your own experience or the accumulated conclusions and conventional wisdom that you find in all fields of endeavor. There's nothing wrong, by the way, with conventional wisdom, because it is sort of wisdom. The problem is it's conventional. And because it's conventional, it's the enemy of creativity. It's a substitute for wondering if you can see this in a totally different way. So I think you have now, at the height of your powers, the capacity to look at familiar things and to see them in a totally different way and understand that they could actually be different. And this ability will last for an unknown number of years, maybe 20. And none of this is specific to the choices that you make about work or career. There are lots of examples of creativity that you know about in the fields you'll be in, on stages in libraries, labs, garages, legislatures, Wall Street, all over the place. And at this point I wanted to make, and it doesn't have anything to do with being well-known or famous. In fact, the truth is that doesn't matter much at all. And there's nothing urgent about it, the way I think about it. You don't have to rush around and try to find something that you really want to do that's creatively different. It's just going to happen. Later in life, in addition to all the achievements you've piled up, you'll be good at lots of things as well. You'll have a lot of experience. You'll be wiser. You probably won't feel wiser. You'll be grandparents. You'll have led organizations. Lots of things. And all of that will be thrust upon you in a perfectly natural way. And it'll occupy, as it should, time and energy and emotional commitment. But it will also slowly take away from you the intensity of focus that you tend to have now, that you can't have later on with all these other demands on your time and energy. When I was a PhD student in economics, the conventional wisdom was, and I believe still is, that you should finish your coursework, take the general exams, pick a safe topic for your thesis, one that fits into a well-defined niche in a discipline, get it done, graduate, get a job, learn to teach, and then, finally, you can think about becoming creative and doing something original in your field. So I thought that didn't sound like much fun. So I ignored it. And I set out into largely uncharted territory in economics, the details of which don't matter for this purpose. And my advisors, very powerful and wonderful human beings, Ken Arrow, Tom Schelling, and Dick Zeckhauser, could have said to me, Mike, we really think this is awfully risky. And if they had, to be honest with you, they had the kind of stature and influence on me. If they had done that, I'm not sure to this day whether I would have tread out on a path or a road that was somewhat less traveled by. But they didn't say that. Instead, they said, just go give it a try. And so I guess what I'm trying to do by telling you this story today, in a very small way, is to do for you what they did for me. And that is this. When you stumble, and I use that word advisedly, on an idea, a vision, an opportunity, whatever it is that may change the way people see or understand or act or organize themselves and deal with the challenges and opportunities that we face. And I believe you will. And this is the only advice I'll hand out today. My advice would be just go for it. Thanks very much.
Go into a bit more detail what you mean by information asymmetries in developing markets. I mean, what's the major problem and what needs to be done?
I don't think what I was referring to there is some markets have, let me be a little bit theoretical here economically. Many markets have natural asymmetries that adversely affect their performance. Many of those markets can't self-correct. The adverse selection and other things that are caused by the asymmetries is too great. In the developed countries, for example, many financial markets have this characteristic. You just imagine the problem of unregulated financial disclosure. Now, it's true, institutions would develop around that and do in other countries. Companies are privately held. Trust matters. Families matter. I mean, I don't want to be overly simple about this. There are ways around this. But if you look carefully at China, what you see is an increasingly pattern of relying on markets, including their nascent financial markets, and a careful building up in parallel of the regulatory and other institutions that are the supporting kind of public sector side of it. All of that takes time. The other thing that takes time is for teams, if you like, or cohorts of investors who are used to focusing on specific domestic classes of assets, for those groups to become more broad in what they look at. I mean, let me describe it. So if we had a situation now in which investors in Europe and America knew as much about the financial structure and risk structure of Korean corporations as they do about American corporations, then some of the volatility we observed in 1998 wouldn't have occurred. And that is a combination of just human capital and investment in making these markets work with the informational underpinnings, and it's partly regulation and disclosure. There's one other problem in the global economy, which I didn't talk about, but let me just mention it quickly. I believe that sometimes markets move around so fast they hurt people more than is tolerable. And in most countries, what happens when that happens is the government steps in and gets in the way of the market forces and does something about it. My description of that is politics trumps economics, when it matters. And actually, I think that's the way the world should be. In the global economy, you do not have yet the analog of the domestic governance structure of the economy, at least in a democratic country. You've got institutions that are learning, but they're incomplete. And indeed, one of the more intelligent parts of the anti-globalization movement is concern about the governance structure of the global economy, the ability decisively and with appropriate authority to step in when it's needed, in exactly the way that our Federal Reserve Bank steps in when there's a liquidity problem or something else in our own economy. I mean, these are things we now take for granted, but learned painfully through our inability to do it in the Great Crash and the Great Depression and so on. That's the kind of thing I mean. It's a complex set of things, but they are not built yet in the global economy.
You talked about being cautiously optimistic,
Yep.
where we have the means but perhaps not the will. Can you talk a little bit more about why this demographic in particular maybe lacks that will in order to affect change on a global scale when presumably we're the right kind of people to affect that change?
I don't think your demographic, either by age or in any other way, actually is deficient in this. What I do think, in fact, I think it may be the reverse. Let me put it slightly more concretely. The older demographic in Europe could care less about Europe. Many of those people don't plan to leave their town, and they got quite used to lira, thank you, and they didn't appreciate the price increases that occurred when they converted to the euro. The young people really believe in Europe. They believe in labor mobility, multilingual stuff, and so on, at least as best I can tell. So there'll be a natural changing of the political will as the younger generation, becomes a more dominant force just by getting older. But the thing we have in common is that we learn from a very early age about our own system and about politics and about thinking about our communities, and think of all the things you learn, when as you're growing up and in this school in particular. And I think what I really believe is that unless we learn to add this one other piece, which is recognizing that we collectively have an enormous amount of influence in this area, and we need to sort of think about it first and then act on it second. I mean, what I would hope is that 20 years from now, when you and your colleagues are the dominant sort of leaders of the major institutions in the country, that we would also have in all of the advanced countries governments that have, because the citizens require it, clearly defined intentions and goals with respect to the rest of the world that are embedded in a structure where they can actually happen. And I think if we don't do that, then we'll live in a world that, let me put it differently, the reason for doing that is purely in the end self-interested, because the alternative is to live in a world in which there's increasing disaffection and chaos. That's really what I was trying to get at there. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned a lot about the choices you made at the various stages in your career.
Right.
I'm just curious if you could do it again, if there's anything you'd do differently, or at very least, if there's something that you wish you'd known then that you know now.
Yes. There's one thing I didn't do, and I now regret it. I used to think that it would be fun at some stage to go into politics. And then I recovered from that bit of an insanity. And now I think that was one of the dumbest ideas I ever had. But what got lost in the shuffle is I think there is a great deal to be said in many of our countries, and it works pretty well here in America, for being involved in public policy in some way. And I think when I went from being an economist to an academic administrator, I learned a lot about organizations and how they work and how to help people get things done. And I don't regret any of that. But if I have one regret, I think I would have liked, I don't know how I would have done it, to spend some time working on policy things, either in Washington or somewhere, maybe in an international organization, but where that was the focus, as opposed to getting the organization to define and deliver on its mission. But that's really the only exception I can think of. Yes, one more. Yeah, hey, Chris.
This is a little bit of a tag-on, but you mentioned also that your energies are kind of diffused right now in a lot of different directions, and I just wonder what you get most excited about right now, and what your major goals are for the next couple of decades.
Yeah, what was that, Myron? Pilates? Yeah. Diet? I'm actually, that's a good question. I'm going back to economics. And I'm not sure, when you've done it when you're young and you're an applied theorist, there's some questions about what you're actually going to do. But the thing that fascinates me most, as somebody who worked on the informational structure of markets, is trying to understand in the long term what the effect of network-based information technology is on the structure of markets, the creation of them, the pricing in them, the valuations, and so on. That clearly, if we can get to think about that with somewhat greater precision than we can now, with the benefit of models, then I think there are policy implications of that, so I would have to say I was interested in that. But let me just give you two examples. I mean, Bob Solow received the Nobel Prize for just extraordinarily important work on technological change, and it continues to be an important part of economics and the theory of economic growth. Technical change is modeled as operating on production functions, because in the context of economics at the time, that's perfectly natural. And that's not a crazy idea. It could be labor saving or capital saving or just operate overall. Well, I believe with this technology that we have technical change that operates on production functions to the extent that embedded in either companies or firms or larger units are what amount to transaction cost reductions that are just hidden in there in the function. But we also are experiencing change directly on transaction costs, visibly on transaction costs. And so we haven't modeled that yet, right? We haven't modeled change in trade patterns and absolute and relative prices that result not from changing the production functions, but changing the accessibility of the inputs and the production and processes together in various parts of the world to other parts. The second observation is, and this may be a little bit bogus, but if you look at the outsourcing of various kinds of information technology-related services to India and other countries, this may be the first time in which human capital or an input is directly an input to a production function of a service that's being delivered in another country. That's not the conventional supply chain. The conventional supply chain, which is usually when people are imaging, they're thinking about manufacturing. There's a production function over there. There's an economy with a vector of assets that determines productivity and relative prices. They have a cost advantage. And then there are a bunch of other costs you have to incur, including some confusion and whatnot, in order to take advantage of that asset and then get the goods to the market where it needs to be. This is a much more direct effect. I mean, you have Indian labor delivering services minute by minute to customers and consumers in all of our countries. So that's the kind of thing that I think at least bears looking at, and from an economic point of view. I try to follow the technology, and there are things related to what Eric's going to talk about that are similar to that. But anyway, that's a bit long-winded. That's where I'd like to be. About time? Thanks very much.